Well, now this is grade 9, and in grade 9 we look at the way through the Hebrew Bible. This is where we pay a little more attention to the Old Testament and the books of the Old Testament. But let's begin with introducing the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament. First of all, we need to understand the geography of the Hebrew Bible. When we look at the stories throughout the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament, we are basically dealing with the area of the world we call today the Middle East. The countries of Israel, Egypt, parts of Arabia, Syria, Lebanon, parts of Iraq. It's mostly around that area. The furthest extent was to the eastern borders of modern-day Iraq, almost to Iran, and to the Mediterranean Sea. And to the north, up to Syria, almost to Turkey, and then south all the way down to Egypt and a little bit of Ethiopia. So that's the concentration of the land. We also need to think about the language or the languages. The Old Testament, or the Hebrew Bible as the name implies, was written mainly in Hebrew, though there were some portions that were written in a cousin language called Aramaic. But other than that, it's mostly Hebrew, and Aramaic and Hebrew are very close to each other. So it was not in English, and we need to come to terms with that as well. And so you've got the lands, you've got the languages. Then we need to consider authorship. Well, the Hebrew Bible is a very long portion. More than 2/3 of the Bible is Old Testament. There were a lot of authors, ranging from Moses to the various prophets. And some books like the Psalms have multiple authorship because they are a collection of songs. But some books like Chronicles, we don't even know who may have written that particular set of books. And so we've got a variety of authors, some prophets, some that are unknown. We have kings that wrote, David and Solomon. We have some other names so we know little about. There were some Levites who wrote, so there's a little bit of authorship that is involved. Now, time frame, the Old Testament stretched through a period of about 1,000 years. The first book, Genesis, was probably written around 1500 BC, and these books stretch all the way across to around 420 BC. So for about 1,000 years, we are dealing with books, one after the other, over periods of time, and eventually collected into what we call the Old Testament. And then, of course, when you talk about the history of the Old Testament, we can also see it in terms of periods. Before the flood, after the flood, the patriarch periods, that's Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then you have the Exodus period, the Judges. After that comes the King period, divided and split alongside the prophet period. And eventually it ends with the people in exile and then having returned from exile from Babylon. So you have specific period from pre-flood to post-exile. And that basically covers the history of the Old Testament. When dealing with the Hebrew Bible, we need to look at it from another angle. For instance, the people who put together the Hebrew Bible, the Jewish authorities, the Jewish rabbis, divided the books into three portions, three segments. The first portion is called Torah, that includes only the books, the 5 books of Moses. And then you have a portion called the Nevi'im, which means prophets. That's where all the prophet books appear, including some historical books that were considered in the prophet group, like Samuel. And then you have the third set called Ketuvim, which means the writings. And this included books like Psalms, Proverbs, Chronicles, and so on. So it's a little different arrangement from the English Old Testament, which was redone by the Greek scholars in the 2nd century BC and rearranged into the order that we have. Christians call it the Pentateuch, which has different sections as well. Now, the books of the Hebrew Bible were finally canonized and became official standard scripture around 100 AD at a place called Jamnia. So all the collections had been made, all the copies had been made, and then they agreed on the fixed text, these books, and no more than those books. But of course, over the years, you have a group of scribes known as Masoretes who kept working and improving the text until we have a final copy called the Masoretic text, which came around 970 AD. And that became the official Bible of the Old Testament for both the Jews and the Christians. But of course, over the years, there were copies made, lots and lots of copies, some very old ones, some newer ones, and all of these copies, they are known as manuscripts, or MSS for short. So when you see MSS in any theological reading, that means manuscripts in relationship to the Bible. And to understand the Hebrew Bible fully, we need to rely on the Masoretic text, but sometimes consulting some other manuscripts does provide some angles, some perspectives that we may not always have. And so it's important to know all these different sections and how everything came together and became the Bible. The first segment of the Hebrew Bible is called Torah. And it's very hard to translate that because the word Torah is derived from a verb which means to instruct, to teach. So you can think of the Torah as the instructions of God. But it's really not just instructions, because you've got stories, you've got a little bit of history, and you've got laws and a number of other types of things. What is more important is that Torah makes up the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. These books are believed to have been written by Moses. So when we say Torah, we're talking about one author, and that was Moses. The Torah holds a very special place in the Hebrew Bible. It is considered like the most holy part of the Hebrew Bible. So in Jewish worship, Torah is often preserved as a scroll in a special cabinet called an ark, and it's read every Sabbath at synagogue worship. These first 5 books give us the basic history of how the world began and how the nation of Israel began as well. And so it's a very special place. Now, there are lots of laws in the Torah, in every book, but particularly in the book of Leviticus, the central book. But we discover that the laws involve moral concepts, like the 10 words or 10 commandments. They involve laws about food, laws about agriculture, laws about sacrifices and worship, laws about family, laws about relationships between neighbors and relationships between men and women, relationship between Israel and foreigners. And so the instructions of the Torah are put out in terms of laws, and these laws cover every area, every facet of life. It's a very complete document, and many of those laws still can be applied today, or at least the ideas behind the laws can still be applied today. What is important is this, that by the time we get to the New Testament, is that Jesus is seen and portrayed as the fulfillment of Torah. That he is the one who fulfills the laws. He is the one who fulfills the sacrifices we find in the Torah. He is the one who fulfills the priesthood we find in the Torah. He is the true descendant and as well as father of the nation that Abraham was. So every story, every law, every worship item, including that big sanctuary that they made, which we will look at later, all of these spoke about Jesus. So Jesus is in the Torah, or the Torah is all about Jesus. And that's what the real instruction is all about. The first book of the Torah and the first book of the Bible is Genesis. The word Genesis implies beginning. The Hebrew name actually means beginning. The Hebrew name is Bereshit, which means in the beginning. It's that first sentence that you find in the Bible. Now, to understand the book of Genesis, you need to understand certain things of how the book works. For example, the book begins with this big cosmic picture, the creation of heavens and earth. Heavens and earth means the universe. And then it narrows down to the story of the flood, and then it narrows down to the story of Abraham, and then Abraham's descendants. But as it narrows in scope, it increases in details. So the story of creation takes place in 2 chapters, but the stories about the descendants of Abraham, the children of Jacob, occupy some 14 chapters. There's a lot more details. So the focus goes inward like this, but the narrative details goes outward like this. The more global, less information. The more local, a lot more information. It's also a book of stories, storytelling. So the stories are all related in the same way. They're short, they don't make moral judgments, there's not much emotion, it's fact-based, and it moves very quickly. In the stories, God is very involved until we come to the stories of the brothers, the sons of Jacob. In those final stories, God is not very involved. He is in the backdrop. He is a player, but he's not involved like in the Abraham or Adam or Noah sections of the book, where God is always talking and God is always available with them. It's important to understand this movement because the book traces what we would call the family line of Jesus, beginning with Adam, then Noah, then Abraham, then Jacob, and then particular sons of Jacob, leading up to the last son that is discussed, Judah, who would be the actual heir to the family as well as the family line of Jesus. So it sets out the backdrop. It sets out the time frame. It sets out the stories that create the rest of the Bible. And understanding how those stories work is important. There's one more little clue to understanding Genesis. The most important character, the most important information always comes at the end of a list. So for example, the Sabbath creation comes at the end after all the 6 days of things were created. The creation of humans come as the last thing created after all the animals and planetary bodies and birds and fishes have been created. In the family stories, the important person in the story is always introduced last. And this is how we know that Judah is the most important person, because he is the last one that's introduced. And so when we understand how the book works, then it's easy for us to follow what the book is doing, how it is leading and preparing us for future history. Book number 2 is called Exodus. It's derived from the word that means to come out. The book begins with the story of how Abraham's descendants, the people of Israel or the Hebrew people, were in Egypt, and the Egyptians, after a period of tolerance, decided, we cannot trust these Hebrews. Who knows if they're really on our side or not, and so they enslaved them. Some real hardship for over 100 years. There was trouble. And then a man appears in the book by the name of Moses, who is sent by God as a deliverer. Now, if you recall the lessons from earlier in grade 6, we talked a little bit about this man, his birth, his special birth, and miracle escape, how he becomes a prince, and then he becomes a shepherd, and now he becomes the deliverer. But the book moves very quickly from that to the Exodus. The Exodus is when Israel were allowed to come out of Egypt and escape. They didn't just escape because God bombarded the Egyptians with plagues or punishments until the Pharaoh says, okay, you can leave. And then there are these amazing stories about the sea opening up so they could walk across, and the encounter with God on Mount Sinai. At that mountain, the people had a covenant made with them. This is like an agreement, a contract that God made with them, and says, if you will be faithful to me, I will always take care of you. It's a little more complicated. We'll deal with covenant later during the series. Okay, but then nearly half of the book deals with one particular subject, the instructions for and the building of the tabernacle or the sanctuary as we know it. That sanctuary became the most important part of the life of Israel. It became the center of their life. The purpose for building it, as God spoke to Moses, is so I can live among you, so that you will know I'm here. I'm not just some God way up far there in space, but I'm a God who's down here, who's right with you, who's involved in your affairs, in your promises. The same God who brought them out of Egypt, opened the sea for them, now is going to live with them. And in this way, they would know that God is for them, God is always with them, and God can be depended upon. Now, it didn't mean that the people of Israel understood what the covenant meant and all of its implications, but at least they had it. So even though the book of Exodus is about that coming out of Egypt, and most people, that's all they think about, but about half of the book is about the sanctuary. Now that God has brought them out of the slavery in Egypt, what will He do with them? The most important thing that God does for His people is to live with them, to be there for them when they need Him the most. Book number 3, which is also the central book of the Torah, is Leviticus. Basically, Leviticus is law. A little bit of narrative, but the rest of it is law. But there are different kinds of laws. For instance, you have the laws about sacrifices, how they should worship, the everyday thing. When you do something wrong, or if you want to praise God, you have to bring a sacrifice to the sanctuary. What kind of sacrifice? For what purpose? Depending on what status you have. It was very complete instructions. Then there were also laws about special celebrations known as the festivals. There were 7 festivals that were given to Israel. Weekly ones, annual ones, occasional ones, they had all these festivals. And the festivals were a reminder of that grand occasion of this great grand God who's always with His people. But there was a section of the book that is considered the holiness code. And in this section, there are laws about life, particularly laws about relationships. How should parents and children relate to each other? How should husbands treat their wives? How should sons behave? What is proper relationship sexually, morally, between family members, between relatives, between the different genders? What would be the proper relationship between people and God? How should they relate to God? What kind of people should they be in His presence? So the book is full of this kind of instruction. A very intriguing part of the book are food laws. Leviticus gives very specific laws for what you can eat and cannot eat. It simply separates animals, fish, and birds into 2 categories. Called clean means you can eat. If it's called unclean, means you cannot eat. And of course, you have to read the details in the books. But basically, the idea was this. If something is clean, it can be used for food, but more importantly, it can be used for sacrifice. If something is unclean, then you can't eat it because it cannot be sacrificed. That is the foundation rule. Otherwise you'll misunderstand the food laws that are in Leviticus. But this is how Leviticus works. An important principle of the book is this. If you mix different things, then you get a mixed world, and that is sinful. Anything that is mixture, whether it is in sexuality or agriculture, whether it is in clothes or food, anything that involves mixing becomes unacceptable to God. And so that's an important part of understanding how Leviticus works. It's a book of laws, but the laws were meant to show the separation. And any kind of mixing between clean and unclean becomes unacceptable to God. The book of Numbers, number 4 in the Torah series, has what you might call a roller coaster or a pendulum structure. Every time God does something good, the people of Israel complain or murmur about it. Another blessing, another complaint. It goes like that through the entire book. And there are some pictures that emerge from Numbers, and it's important to understand those pictures in order to understand the book. One of the pictures is this, that the book is full of complaint and murmuring. It tells us that humans are never satisfied. We always want more. When we get more, we want even more. And so you say to yourself, I want $1 million. But when you've made $1 million, you want $1 billion. Humans are never content. They're never satisfied. So some people have labeled the book of Numbers as murmuring theology. The people were always complaining. God gave manna, they complained. He gave water, they complained. And every blessing was turned into a curse. The leader of God, Moses, was constantly challenged in the book. People did not like his leadership. His own family challenged him. His tribe's people challenged him. People challenged him. It was always, who do you think you are? Are you the real leader of God? We can lead ourselves. And it's very hard being a leader of God's people when they are like this. And yet, through all of that, you see that God always protects Israel. Every time they are attacked, God would be there for them. And He provided for all of their needs. When they were thirsty in the desert, He made water come out of rocks. But the most important provision is a food from heaven called manna, described as the food of angels. And this lasted for 40 years while they were in the desert, never ran out. But how do the people respond? Well, throughout the book, you see just one kind of response from the people of Israel: ingratitude. The most ungrateful people that you could find in history. They were ungrateful. Ungrateful to Moses for his leadership, ungrateful to God for his blessings, ungrateful for the blessing. It seems that they were ungrateful. You know, the last command in the 10 words of God says this: do not desire things that God hasn't given you. You know, most people know the 10 commandments. That's probably a good paraphrase of that 10th one. If you desire anything that has not been given, then you're going to be discontented. If you're discontented, you're going to complain. If you're going to complain, even God will become the object of your complaint. And so the book of Numbers is the book of complaints. It's long history, 40 years of history, but very sad and tragic history. A people given so much, but never satisfied. I hope that you and I can learn a lesson from them. All right, the final book of the Torah is Deuteronomy. And literally the name, which is actually from Greek, means second law. It's not really second law. The book is more like the memoirs, the memories of Moses. See, before Moses died, he knew his time was up. For 40 years he had been the leader, and God had told him, you will not go into the land. It is your assistant Joshua who will take you in. So Moses decides to write down everything that he could remember of that journey. So you have the complete history of those 40 years and every experience and every law, every instruction, every encounter with God and with other nations. It's written down in Deuteronomy. Moses left a final record for the people to remember. But he also added certain ideas. For instance, he added the idea of what is known as the Shema, a passage in Deuteronomy 6 which encapsulates everything that's important about relationship with God. And you can reduce that passage basically to this: love God with everything you have and live according to His instructions. And if you do that, everything will be fine. It contains blessings and promises. It even contains a description of the promised land. And then towards the end of the book, we meet the new leader. You see, God was not about to leave Israel leaderless. It's time for Moses to go. But for 40 years, he had been preparing the man who would take over, and that was Joshua. So this book is important. Even though it's a repetition, everything in the book is a repetition of previous history, materials from Numbers, laws from Leviticus, and some of the experiences from Exodus. But in the end, these memoirs of an old leader are very important to us because it tells us that he saw the way of God very clearly. And he wanted to make sure that even though he's leaving them, God is not leaving them. And so his thoughts, his ideas would be there to guide them in the coming years through a new leader called Joshua. So it's not really a second law, as we would think. It's more of a reminiscence of the past with hope for the future. And that is how we live our faith, remembering what God did in the past in order to find strength for the future.